The doctor's words echoed through the small parlor like a death sentence, each syllable cutting deeper than the last as he pronounced Georgia Owens barren and worthless to any man who might want heirs. She stood frozen in her Sunday dress, watching her husband Marcus's face transform from concern to disgust in the span of a single breath. And she knew with terrible certainty that her life in San Antonio was ending right there in that stifling room where the curtains were drawn against the Texas sun. Marcus didn't wait for the doctor to leave before he started throwing her belongings into the street. His mother stood on the porch with her arms crossed, satisfaction gleaming in her cold eyes as she watched her son cast out the wife who had failed in what she considered a woman's most sacred duty. Georgia gathered what she could carry, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the handle of her carpetbag, while neighbors peered through windows and whispered behind their hands. The shame burned hotter than the August heat beating down on the dusty streets. She had nowhere to go. Her parents were dead, buried 3 years past from the fever that had swept through the city. Her sister had married a rancher up north and moved away before Georgia's own wedding. There were no cousins nearby, no aunts or uncles to take her in. She was 23 years old with $37 to her name and a reputation that would follow her like a shadow no matter where she tried to hide. The boarding house on the edge of town took her money, but not her dignity. The owner, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Hutchins, made it clear that Georgia would need to find work quickly or find herself on the street again. But work was scarce for a woman with her particular brand of shame. The respectable families wouldn't hire her as a governess or companion, fearing she might corrupt their daughters with her supposed defectiveness. The shops had all the help they needed. Even the laundry refused her, the owner saying plainly that his wife wouldn't stand for having such a woman around. Georgia spent 3 weeks watching her savings dwindle while the walls of her tiny room seemed to close in a little more each day. She could feel the other boarders avoiding her, could hear them whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. Marcus had made sure everyone knew why he'd cast her out, had made certain the whole city understood that she was damaged goods, unfit for marriage or motherhood. The humiliation was a living thing that wrapped around her throat and made it hard to breathe. On a Monday morning when the heat was already oppressive before the sun had fully risen, Mrs. Hutchins knocked on her door with an expression that told Georgia everything she needed to know. Her money had run out. She had until noon to vacate the premises. Georgia packed her carpetbag for the second time in a month, this time with even fewer possessions than before because she'd had to sell her good shoes and winter coat just to eat. The stage depot was crowded with travelers heading to all corners of Texas and beyond. Georgia stood in line with her last few dollars clutched in her hand, listening to the destinations being called out. Houston, Galveston, Austin. Each place seemed as impossible as the last, each one a city where her reputation might follow her before she even arrived. Then she heard a name that meant nothing to her, a place so small she'd never even heard of it, Trinity, Texas. Northeastern part of the state, the clerk said when she asked. Small town, maybe 200 people. Stage left in an hour. Cost her $12. Georgia bought the ticket. The journey took 2 days of rattling across rough roads, through pine forests and past small settlements that looked like they were barely clinging to existence. The other passengers changed at various stops, people coming and going with their own stories and destinations. Georgia kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, staring out the window at the landscape that grew increasingly wild and untamed the farther they traveled from San Antonio. Trinity appeared through the trees like something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. It was smaller than she'd imagined, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single dirt street that looked like it turned to soup whenever it rained. There was a general store, a saloon, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and a scattering of houses that ranged from modest to ramshackle. The stage depot was nothing more than a bench outside the general store where the driver left mail and packages. Georgia climbed down with her carpet bag and stood in the street while the stage rumbled away, leaving her in a silence broken only by the sound of chickens clucking somewhere behind one of the buildings. She had $3 left, no prospects, and no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the life that had rejected her. The general store was dim and smelled of coffee and leather, and something sweet she couldn't quite identify. The man behind the counter was in his 50s with a weathered face and kind eyes that assessed her without judgment. She asked about work, and he shook his head slowly, saying times were hard and most folks did for themselves out here. But he mentioned that the boarding house might have a room if she had money. It was run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who sometimes took in travelers. The boarding house was actually just Mrs. Patterson's home, a tidy 2-story building painted white with green shutters. The widow herself was a woman of perhaps 60 with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a direct gaze that seemed to see right through Georgia's carefully maintained composure. She listened to Georgia's request for a room without interrupting, her expression never changing. "I can give you a room for a week," Mrs. Patterson said finally. $2. After that, you'll need to figure something out because I'm not running a charity." Georgia paid the $2 and followed the widow upstairs to a small room that was clean and sparse, but felt like a palace after the boarding house in San Antonio. She set her carpet bag on the narrow bed and sat beside it, suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She'd been running on fear and desperation for so long that now, in this quiet room in this unknown place, everything caught up with her at once. She lay down on the bed still wearing her dress and shoes and slept for 14 hours straight. When she woke, the sun was streaming through the window and she could hear voices from somewhere below. Her stomach was cramping with hunger, reminding her that she'd barely eaten during the journey. She washed her face in the basin on the dresser, pinned up her dark hair as neatly as she could manage, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen making bread. The widow glanced up when Georgia appeared in the doorway. "There's coffee on the stove. Bread from yesterday in the box. Help yourself." Georgia ate standing up, too hungry to bother with manners, while Mrs. Patterson kneaded dough with strong, capable hands. The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what she needed. The bread was dry but filling. It was the best meal she'd had in weeks. "Thank you," Georgia said when she'd finished. Mrs. Patterson dusted flour from her hands. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question, but Georgia answered anyway. "Yes. Husband, ex-husband." The widow nodded as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Well, Trinity's a good place for starting over if that's what you're after. Folks here mind their own business mostly. We've all got things we'd rather not discuss." Georgia felt something loosen in her chest, just a little. "I need work. I'll do anything honest. Can you cook?" "Yes." "So?" "Yes. Handle livestock." Georgia hesitated. "I could learn." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "There's a rancher about 5 miles from here who's been looking for someone to help keep house. Lost his mother last winter and the place has gone to ruin from what I hear. He's not much for company and keeps to himself, but he pays fair and he's honest. Name's Nathan Turner. If you're interested, I can take you out there tomorrow." George's heart was pounding. A job. A real job. It didn't matter that it was for a reclusive rancher or that it was miles from town. It was a chance, and chances were something she couldn't afford to refuse. Yes, thank you, I'm very interested. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorching day. Mrs. Patterson hitched up her wagon, and they set out along a rutted track that wound through tall pines and across clearings where wildflowers bloomed in defiant splashes of color. The land here was different from San Antonio, greener and more heavily forested, with creeks running clear over smooth stones and birds calling from the branches overhead. The Turner Ranch appeared gradually, first as cleared land with grazing cattle, then as fences in need of repair, and finally as a house and barn that had seen better days. The house was a simple structure, single-story with a porch that wrapped around the front. The barn was larger and in somewhat better condition. Chickens scattered as the wagon approached, and a pair of horses watched from the corral with mild curiosity. A man emerged from the barn, and Georgia felt her breath catch. Nathan Turner was tall and lean with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered from years in the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he'd once smiled more than he did now. He wore work clothes that had seen hard use, and he moved with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Georgia guessed he was perhaps 30, give or take a year or two. He approached the wagon slowly, his expression neutral and a bit wary. "Mrs. Patterson, Nathan." The widow climbed down with Georgia following. "Brought someone who might be able to help you with your housekeeping situation. This is Georgia Owens. She's new to Trinity and looking for work." Nathan's gray eyes moved to Georgia, and she felt herself being assessed with the same care he might give to a horse he was considering purchasing. She lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. "Can you cook?" His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Yes." "Clean?" "Yes. This place is a mess. Haven't had time to keep up with it proper since Ma died. Need someone who can make it livable again. 3 meals a day, laundry, general tidying. I'm gone most days working the herd." "Don't need conversation or company, just someone who can handle the work." Georgia nodded. "I can handle it." He named a wage that was more than fair, adding that room and board were included. Georgia tried not to let her relief show too plainly on her face as she agreed to the terms. Nathan said she could start immediately if she wanted, and Mrs. Patterson said she'd bring Georgia's things from the boarding house that afternoon. And just like that, Georgia had a job and a place to live. The house was indeed a disaster. Dust coated every surface, dishes were piled in the basin, and the floors looked like they hadn't been swept in months. The bedroom Nathan showed her to was sparse but clean enough, with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the yard. He gave her a brief tour of the kitchen, pointing out where things were kept, then excused himself to get back to work, leaving Georgia alone in the chaos. She started with the kitchen, heating water and washing every dish and pot she could find. Then she swept the floors, beating rugs outside and watching clouds of dust billow away on the breeze. She scrubbed the table and counters, washed the windows until they sparkled, and went through the pantry to take stock of what supplies were available. By the time the sun was setting, the kitchen and main room were transformed. Georgia had found chicken in the cold cellar and potatoes in the pantry, and she had a simple but hearty meal ready when Nathan came in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway, blinking in surprise at the clean space and the smell of food cooking. "You work fast," he said. "There's a lot to do. This is just the beginning." He washed up at the basin by the door and sat down at the table. Georgia served him and then stood awkwardly, unsure if she was supposed to eat with him or wait. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up. "Sit. Food's hot. No point letting it get cold." They ate in silence. Nathan didn't seem inclined toward conversation, and Georgia was too tired to initiate any. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of two people who understood that words weren't always necessary. The food was good, the house was clean, and for the first time in weeks, Georgia felt like she could breathe without something pressing down on her chest. After dinner, Nathan thanked her briefly and disappeared outside to do evening chores. Georgia washed the dishes, banked the fire, and retreated to her room. She lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside at night, the crickets and frogs and distant calls of night birds, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The days fell into a rhythm. Georgia rose early to make breakfast, packed Nathan a lunch for the range, and spent her days cleaning and organizing and slowly bringing the house back to life. She washed curtains and mended torn fabric, scrubbed floors and polished furniture, worked in the neglected garden and coaxed it back to productivity. Nathan was gone most days from dawn to dusk, coming home tired and dusty and always surprised by whatever improvement Georgia had made. He was a man of few words, but Georgia learned to read him anyway. Learned that he took his coffee black and strong, that he had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, that his shoulders relaxed when he walked into a clean, welcoming house at the end of a long day. She learned that he'd inherited the ranch from his father, that his mother had been his only family, that her death had hit him harder than he wanted to admit. Georgia found herself working harder than she'd ever worked in her life, but it was satisfying work, the kind that left her tired in body but settled in mind. She was useful here, needed. It didn't matter that Nathan rarely spoke to her beyond necessary exchanges. Didn't matter that he kept a careful distance between them. She had a purpose, and that was enough. 3 weeks after she'd arrived, she was in the garden pulling weeds when Nathan came back to the house in the middle of the day. She looked up in surprise, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw him standing at the edge of the garden watching her. "Something wrong?" she asked, getting to her feet. He shook his head slowly. "Just wanted to say you've done good work here. Place looks better than it has in a year. Ma would have approved." It was the most he'd said to her since that first day, and Georgia felt warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you. That means a lot." He nodded once, started to turn away, then paused. "You don't talk much about yourself." Georgia bent to gather the weeds she'd pulled, avoiding his eyes. "Not much to tell. Everyone's got a story. Mine's not very interesting." "Fair enough. Just wanted you to know that I don't pry into folks' business. Whatever brought you here, it stays in the past as far as I'm concerned. You do good work and you're honest. That's all that matters out here." He left before she could respond, striding back toward the barn with his hat pulled low against the sun. Georgia stood in the garden clutching weeds in her dirty hands and felt tears sting her eyes. She'd been bracing herself for questions, for judgment, for the inevitable moment when her past caught up with her. But Nathan was offering her something she'd never expected: acceptance without conditions. Summer deepened into its full heat, and Georgia found herself settling into life on the ranch with an ease that surprised her. She rose with the sun and went to bed when the stars were bright overhead, her days filled with work that felt meaningful in a way her old life never had. She learned how to handle the chickens without getting pecked, how to coax bread to rise properly in the temperamental oven, how to tell when the garden needed water by the look of the leaves. And slowly, carefully, she and Nathan began to talk. It started small. Comments about the weather, observations about the cattle, questions about supplies needed from town. But gradually the conversations grew longer, more personal. Nathan told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the hard winter when they'd lost half the herd and nearly lost the ranch itself. Georgia found herself sharing carefully edited pieces of her own past, talking about her parents and her childhood in San Antonio, while carefully avoiding any mention of Marcus or the doctor or the word that had destroyed her life. She learned that Nathan had a quiet sense of humor, dry and unexpected, that caught her off guard and made her laugh when she least expected it. She learned that he was patient and steady, that he treated his animals with gentle respect, that he'd once wanted to be a horse trainer, but circumstances had kept him tied to the ranch. She learned that loneliness had become such a familiar companion to him that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day. And Nathan learned things about Georgia too. Learned that she was stronger than she looked, that she had a stubborn streak that came out when she was working on something difficult, that she sang softly to herself when she thought no one was listening. Learned that sadness lived in her eyes even when she smiled, that she flinched sometimes when things got too loud or sudden, that she was running from something that had hurt her deeply. One evening in late July, they were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. It had become their routine, this quiet time before Nathan went to do evening chores and Georgia cleaned up the kitchen. The heat of the day was finally breaking, and there was a slight breeze that rustled the leaves and brought the scent of pine. "Can I ask you something?" Nathan said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. Georgia tensed slightly but kept her gaze on the sunset. "You can ask." "What made you pick Trinity? Seems like an odd choice for someone from San Antonio." She was quiet for a long moment, trying to decide how much to tell him. Finally, she said, "I needed somewhere nobody knew me, somewhere I could start fresh without my past following me around." "Must have been bad, whatever it was." "It was." "Want to talk about it?" "Not particularly." He nodded, accepting this without pressing. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you ended up here. Don't know what I'd have done without you." "Probably would have been eating beans straight from the can and living in a pigsty." Georgia smiled despite herself. "The house wasn't that bad. It was pretty bad. Well, maybe a little bad." They fell back into silence, but it felt different now, warmer somehow. Georgia found herself acutely aware of Nathan beside her, of the way the fading light caught in his dark hair, of the strength in his work-roughened hands, of the line of his profile against the colorful sky. She pushed the thoughts away firmly, reminding herself that she was here to work, that Nathan had given her a job and a home when she'd had nothing, that letting herself feel anything more than gratitude would be foolish and dangerous. But her heart wasn't listening to reason. August arrived with temperatures that made the house feel like an oven even with all the windows open. Georgia took to doing heavy work in the early morning and late evening, spending the hottest part of the day in the relatively cooler house doing mending or preparing food. Nathan came home earlier on the worst days, the heat making it too dangerous to keep working cattle through the afternoon. On one particularly brutal afternoon, Georgia was in the kitchen trying to get bread dough to rise when Nathan came through the door looking like he'd been dragged behind his horse. His face was flushed, his shirt soaked with sweat, and he was moving with the careful deliberation of someone on the edge of heat exhaustion. "You need to cool down," Georgia said, abandoning her bread. "Sit." He was too tired to argue, dropping into a chair while Georgia pumped cold water from the well into the basin. She soaked a cloth and handed it to him, then got him a glass of water and made him drink it slowly. She wet another cloth and draped it around the back of his neck, ignoring his weak protests. "You're going to make yourself sick working in this heat," she said, her tone sharp with worry. "Cattle don't care about the heat." The cattle will be fine for one afternoon. You won't be fine if you get heat stroke. He looked up at her, something shifting in his gray eyes. You worried about me, Georgia? She realized she was standing very close to him, her hand still on his shoulder from adjusting the cloth. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could see the pulse beating in his throat. Her own heart was hammering, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone has to be, she said quietly. You're not exactly careful with yourself. Haven't had much reason to be careful. Not much point in taking care of yourself when there's no one around to care whether you do or not. The words hung in the hot, still air between them. Georgia found she couldn't look away from his eyes, couldn't step back even though she knew she should. There's someone who cares now, she heard herself say. Nathan's hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his shoulder. His palm was rough and warm and completely engulfed her smaller hand. Georgia, he said, and her name in his rough voice sent shivers down her spine despite the heat. The moment stretched, fragile and charged with possibility. Then Nathan released her hand and stood up, putting necessary distance between them. Thank you for the water. I'll go wash up. He left her standing in the kitchen with her heart racing and her thoughts in chaos. She returned to her bread dough with shaking hands, trying to tell herself that she'd imagined the look in his eyes, the way his voice had softened on her name, the electricity that had sparked between them. But she knew she hadn't imagined it, and that terrified her more than anything. Because what could she offer a man like Nathan Turner? She was barren, damaged, unfit for marriage or motherhood. Her own husband had thrown her into the street rather than keep her. What would Nathan do if he knew? Would he look at her with the same disgust Marcus had? Would he tell her to pack her things and leave? She couldn't bear the thought of losing this place, this life she'd built. Couldn't bear the thought of seeing disappointment in Nathan's eyes. So she resolved to be more careful, to maintain the proper distance between employer and employee, to protect both of them from the heartache that would surely follow if she let her feelings grow any stronger. But resolutions were easier made than kept. A week later, Nathan asked her to ride out with him to check on some cattle in the far pasture. Georgia had learned to ride during her time on the ranch, practicing on a gentle mare named Daisy while Nathan worked. She wasn't an expert, but she could stay in the saddle well enough for a simple ride. They rode out in the relative cool of early morning, through pine forests where dappled sunlight filtered through the branches and across meadows still wet with dew. Nathan pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land. About the winter his father had gotten lost in a snowstorm and survived by sheltering in a cave. About the summer a wildfire had come within a mile of the house before changing direction. The cattle they'd come to check on were grazing peacefully in a lush valley beside a creek. Nathan dismounted to inspect the fences while Georgia stayed on Daisy, watching him work. He moved with easy competence, testing posts and wires, making mental notes of repairs that needed to be done. She found herself admiring the way he moved, the strength in his shoulders, the way his hat shaded his face from the sun. "Come down here," he called to her. "Want to show you something." Georgia dismounted carefully and walked to where he stood by the creek. He pointed to the water, and she saw silvery shapes darting through the clear water. Fish, dozens of them, catching the morning light. "Used to fish here with my pa when I was a boy," Nathan said. "He taught me everything about running cattle, but some of my best memories are just sitting here with a pole, not talking, just being together." Georgia could hear the affection and grief tangled in his voice. "You must miss him. Every day. Lost him 10 years ago. Heart just gave out one day while he was mending fence. Ma found him that evening. Think she never really recovered from it. They were married 35 years, and she always said he'd taken half her heart with him when he died." "That's beautiful," Georgia said softly. sad but beautiful. To love someone that much. Nathan turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. You ever loved anyone like that? The question was dangerous, but Georgia found herself answering honestly. No, I thought I did once, but I was wrong. What I felt was nothing like what your parents had. What happened? She knew she should deflect, should change the subject, but standing there in the morning sunlight beside the creek where the fish danced through the water, she found she couldn't lie to him anymore. I was married. For 2 years. Then a doctor told me I could never have children, and my husband threw me out the same day. Said I was worthless to him without the ability to give him heirs. The words came out flat and emotionless, but inside Georgia was trembling. She waited for Nathan's reaction, for the disappointment or disgust or pity that would surely follow. But when she dared to look at him, all she saw was anger on her behalf. He threw you out. Nathan's voice was tight with controlled fury. What kind of man does that? The kind who only married me for what I could give him, apparently. That's not a man. That's a coward and a fool. Nathan took a step closer to her, his hands clenched at his sides. Georgia, listen to me. What that doctor said, what your husband did, none of that makes you worthless. None of that makes you less than you were before. You understand me? Tears were burning in her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. You don't understand. I'm barren. I can't give a man children. What use am I? What use? Nathan's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. Georgia, you've brought more life to this ranch in 3 months than it's seen in 3 years. You've made it a home again. You've made me remember what it's like to have someone to care about, someone to come home to. You think all that's worthless because of what some doctor said. Nathan, she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. He closed the remaining distance between them and took her hands in his grip warm and steady and sure. I'm going to say something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that? Georgia nodded, not trusting her voice. I've been alone for a long time, by choice mostly. After Ma died, I figured I'd just keep to myself, work the ranch until it worked me into the ground, and that would be my life. Then you showed up and everything changed. At first I told myself I was just grateful for the help, for having someone to keep house. But that's not true. Georgia, I look forward to coming home now. I look forward to sitting on the porch with you in the evenings. I look forward to hearing you sing while you work. I look forward to your smile, rare as it is, and the sound of your laugh, rarer still. I've fallen in love with you, and I don't give a damn what any doctor said or what your worthless excuse for a husband thought. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to make you my wife. Georgia stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Nathan, you're not thinking clearly. You want children. Every man wants children. I can't give you that. Then we'll fill our home with love instead. His voice was fierce and certain. We'll fill it with laughter and warmth and everything that makes a house a home. We'll take and foster children if you want. We'll be the aunt and uncle every kid in Trinity comes to for advice and comfort. We'll fill the space with whatever we want to fill it with. But Georgia, I need you to understand something. I'm not asking you to marry me because I want children. I'm asking you to marry me because I want you, because I love you, because the thought of you leaving, of living without you, is unbearable. The tears she'd been fighting spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. God help me, I love you so much, and I'm terrified of not being enough for you. Nathan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest while she cried. She could hear his heart beating steady and strong beneath her ear, could feel the strength of his arms around her, could smell sun and leather and the scent that was uniquely him. When her tears finally subsided, he tipped her face up to look at him. You're more than enough, he said. You're everything. And then he kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. Georgia melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, kissing him back with all the love and hope and desperate longing she'd been holding inside. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Nathan was smiling, really smiling in a way she'd never seen before. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That's a yes," Georgia said, and felt joy bubble up inside her like a spring after the rain. They rode back to the ranch hand in hand, awkward in the saddle but unwilling to let go of each other. When they reached the house, Nathan helped her down from Daisy and kissed her again, longer this time, until they were both dizzy with it. Then he insisted on doing his chores while Georgia floated through making dinner in a daze of happiness. That evening on the porch, they made plans. Nathan wanted to get married as soon as possible, seeing no point in waiting. Georgia agreed, though her practical nature insisted they do it properly. They would go to Trinity in 2 days and speak to the minister. They would have a simple ceremony with Mrs. Patterson as witness. They would start their married life in the house where they'd already built the foundation of their partnership. "I don't have a ring yet," Nathan said, looking embarrassed. "Pa's ring for Ma is somewhere in the house, but I want to get you your own, something just for you." "I don't need a fancy ring," Georgia said. "I just need you. You're getting a ring anyway. Every bride deserves a ring." They went to Trinity the next day, riding together in the wagon. Nathan held her hand the whole way, his thumb tracing circles on her palm that made her shiver despite the heat. At the general store, he bought her a simple gold band that fit perfectly on her finger. At the minister's house, they arranged for a ceremony the following Saturday. Mrs. Patterson was delighted when they told her, insisting on hosting a small dinner after the ceremony and refusing to take no for an answer. Word spread quickly through the small town, and people Georgia had only seen in passing came up to offer congratulations. There was genuine warmth in their greetings, no judgment or whispers, just happiness for Nathan, who'd been alone too long, and for Georgia, who'd found a home. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Georgia made a new dress from fabric she'd found in a trunk, pale blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Nathan cleaned up the wagon and borrowed a suit from a neighbor who was roughly his size. They worked side by side on the ranch, stealing kisses when the mood struck, making plans for their future together. On Friday night, the night before the wedding, they sat on the porch under a sky full of stars. Georgia was nestled against Nathan's side, his arm around her shoulders, feeling more content than she'd ever felt in her life. "Nervous?" Nathan asked. "Terrified," Georgia admitted, "but in a good way. Like I'm standing on the edge of something wonderful and scary all at once." "I'm terrified too. Keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out this was all a dream." She turned in his arms to look at him. "It's not a dream. I'm real, and I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Promise. I promise." He kissed her, slow and deep, and Georgia felt heat pool low in her belly. They'd been careful to maintain propriety, to not go too far before the wedding, but it was getting harder to pull away. When Nathan finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing hard. "One more day," he said, his voice rough. "Then you're mine." "One more day," Georgia agreed. "Then we're each other's." They were married on a clear Saturday afternoon in the little church with the crooked steeple. Mrs. Patterson stood as witness along with several townspeople who'd come to celebrate. The minister was an older man with kind eyes who spoke about love and partnership and the sanctity of marriage. Nathan held Georgia's hands and said his vows in a steady voice that carried to the back of the church. Georgia said hers with tears in her eyes and joy in her heart. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan kissed her to applause and cheers. They walked out of the church into the sunshine as Mr. and Mrs. Nathan Turner, and Georgia felt like she was floating. The dinner at Mrs. Patterson's was a cheerful affair with good food and better company. People toasted the newlyweds and shared stories about Nathan's childhood and welcomed Georgia officially into the community. It was the family gathering she'd never had, the celebration she'd been denied the first time she married. By the time they climbed into the wagon to head home, Georgia's cheeks hurt from smiling. The sun was setting as they drove back to the ranch, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and pink. Nathan held her hand, his new wedding band gleaming on his finger beside hers. They didn't speak much, didn't need to, both lost in their own thoughts about the night ahead. At the house, Nathan helped her down from the wagon and then, to her surprise, swept her up into his arms. "Got to do this proper," he said, carrying her across the threshold. Georgia laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him as he carried her inside. He set her down in the bedroom, the one that had been his and was now theirs. Georgia had cleaned it thoroughly and put fresh sheets on the bed, had placed wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. Nathan looked around, noticing the small touches, and smiled. "You made it perfect," he said. "I wanted it to be special." He came to her slowly, giving her time to adjust to be sure. His hands were gentle as he began unbuttoning the back of her dress, his lips trailing kisses along her neck that made her shiver. George's hands fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, nervous and eager all at once. They undressed each other slowly, learning the landscape of each other's bodies, whispering words of love and reassurance. When Nathan laid her down on the bed, Georgia felt a moment of fear, memories of her first wedding night and Marcus's impatient, mechanical approach threatening to intrude. But Nathan wasn't Marcus. Nathan took his time, worshiping her body with his hands and mouth, making her feel cherished and desired in ways she'd never experienced. When they finally came together, it was with tenderness and passion, and a connection so deep it brought tears to Georgia's eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, Nathan's hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. Georgia felt complete in a way she'd never felt before, like a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing had finally clicked into place. "I love you," Nathan murmured against her hair. "I love you too," Georgia whispered back. "So much." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and when Georgia woke in the night, she found Nathan still holding her, his face peaceful in sleep. She carefully extracted herself and stood by the window, looking out at the ranch bathed in moonlight. This was her home now. This was her life. And she was so grateful for the twist of fate that had brought her here, to this place, to this man, to this second chance she'd never thought she'd have. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and discovery. They learned each other's rhythms, the small habits and preferences that made up daily life. Nathan learned that Georgia liked to sleep with the window open even when it was cold, that she hummed when she was concentrating, that she got quiet when she was upset rather than loud. Georgia learned that Nathan was grumpy before his first cup of coffee, that he had a scar on his left shoulder from being thrown by a horse when he was 15, that he sometimes woke from nightmares about losing the ranch and needed to be held until he calmed. They worked the ranch together now, a true partnership. Georgia helped with the lighter tasks, feeding chickens and tending the garden and occasionally riding out to check fences. Nathan took on more of the cooking in the evenings so Georgia could rest after long days. They made decisions together, planned improvements together, dreamed together about the future. One evening in October, when the weather had finally cooled and the leaves were starting to turn, Nathan came home with news. He'd been to Trinity that day for supplies and had run into the minister. There was a family in town, the minister said, that was in desperate straits. The father had died in a logging accident, the mother was ill with consumption, and there were 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 10 with no one to care for them. The minister asked if we might consider taking them in, Nathan said carefully. At least temporarily, until they can find a more permanent solution. I know it's a lot to ask, and we've only been married a few months, but I couldn't stop thinking about those kids. About what it would be like to have no one, to be scared and alone. Georgia felt her heart expand. You want to take them in? Only if you do. This has to be a decision we make together. She thought about the empty bedrooms in the house, about all the love she had to give that she'd thought would never have an outlet, about Nathan's words by the creek about filling their home with love. Yes, she said. Let's bring them home. They went to town the next day to meet the family. The mother, Mrs. Collins, was too weak to leave her bed, but her eyes filled with tears of gratitude when Nathan and Georgia explained they wanted to help. The children were thin and scared, huddled together like frightened rabbits. There was Daniel, 10, with his father's dark hair and serious eyes. Sarah, 8, who clutched a worn rag doll. Thomas, 5, who hid behind his older siblings. And little Emma, just 3, with blonde curls and a thumb permanently in her mouth. It took 2 trips to bring all 4 children and their meager belongings to the ranch. The older children were quiet on the ride, suspicious of this change in their circumstances, protective of their younger siblings. Georgia understood their wariness and didn't push, simply showed them their rooms and promised them they were safe here. The first few weeks were an adjustment for everyone. The children were grieving and frightened, acting out in various ways as they tested the boundaries of this new situation. Daniel was defiant and angry, refusing to follow instructions. Sarah had nightmares that woke the whole house. Thomas wouldn't speak at all. Emma cried for her mother at all hours, but Georgia and Nathan were patient. They established routines and held firm to boundaries while also providing the affection and security the children desperately needed. Slowly, gradually, things began to improve. Daniel started helping Nathan with chores and asking questions about ranching. Sarah began to trust Georgia enough to talk about her fears. Thomas said his first words in 3 weeks, asking for more potatoes at dinner. Emma started calling Georgia Mama Georgia and following her everywhere. In December, word came that Mrs. Collins had passed away. It was expected but still heartbreaking, and the children took it hard. But they grieved together, all 6 of them, sitting in the living room by the fire while Nathan held Emma and Georgia held Thomas, and the older children leaned against their sides. They were a family now, bound not by blood but by choice and love and the commitment to take care of each other. As winter settled over the ranch, Georgia found herself busier than she'd ever been but also happier. The house was full of noise and laughter and the controlled chaos of children. Nathan was a wonderful father, patient and kind but also firm when he needed to be. He taught Daniel how to work with the cattle, showed Sarah how to ride, played endless games with Thomas, and carried Emma on his shoulders while doing evening chores. At night, after the children were in bed, Nathan and Georgia would collapse into their own bed exhausted but content. "You were right," Georgia told him one night. "We filled our home with love." "We did," Nathan agreed, pulling her close, "and I wouldn't change a thing." Christmas was a magical affair with 4 excited children making decorations and counting down the days. Nathan cut down a small pine tree, and they decorated it with strings of berries and paper chains. Georgia sewed new clothes for all the children and knitted scarves. Nathan carved toys and whistles. On Christmas morning, the children's faces lit up with joy, and Georgia felt her heart was so full it might burst. In the spring, they received official word that the adoption papers had gone through. Daniel, Sarah, Thomas, and Emma were now legally Turner children. Nathan had insisted on it, wanting to make sure the children would always have a home and a name, would never have to fear being separated or sent away. The children were told at dinner that evening, and Daniel actually smiled, a rare sight that made Georgia tear up. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were illnesses and accidents, droughts and hard winters, arguments and growing pains as the children developed their own personalities and wills. But there was also immeasurable joy. First words and first steps, birthdays and holidays, achievements and milestones. Daniel grew into a strong young man with a natural gift for ranching, eventually taking over more of the daily operations. Sarah discovered a love of horses and began training them, developing a reputation throughout the county. Thomas, quiet Thomas, found his voice through drawing and filled sketchbooks with detailed pictures of ranch life. Emma, the baby who'd been so scared and sad, grew into a bright, laughing child who brought sunshine wherever she went. Georgia watched her children grow with pride and love and a deep sense of gratitude. She'd thought she could never be a mother, had been told she was worthless without the ability to have children. But she'd learned that motherhood had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with love. She was a mother in every way that mattered, and these 4 children were hers just as surely as if she'd given birth to them. Nathan thrived too, the loneliness that had haunted him replaced by purpose and joy. He was an excellent father, involved and affectionate, teaching his children not just about ranching but about integrity and kindness, and the importance of family. Georgia would sometimes watch him with the children and fall in love with him all over again, amazed at the depth of this man she'd married. On their 5th anniversary, Nathan surprised her with a trip to Trinity for dinner at the hotel. Mrs. Patterson watched the children for the evening, shooing them away with instructions to enjoy themselves. Over dinner, Nathan took Georgia's hand and smiled at her. 5 years, he said. Best 5 years of my life. Mine too, Georgia agreed, though I'm not sure teenage Daniel would agree. We've been pretty hard on him lately. He'll thank us when he's older, probably. Nathan laughed. Georgia, I want you to know something. I know the road here wasn't easy for you. I know you went through hell before you found your way to Trinity, but I'm grateful for every step that led you to me. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and not a day goes by that I don't thank God you walked into my life. Tears filled Georgia's eyes. I used to think my life was over when Marcus threw me out. I thought being barren meant I'd never have a real family, never have a home. But I was wrong. You showed me that family is what you make it, that home is where love is, that I was never broken or worthless. You gave me everything I thought I'd lost. We gave each other everything, Nathan corrected. We built this life together. They returned to the ranch that night to find the children all asleep and the house peaceful. Nathan carried Georgia over the threshold again, making her laugh, and they made love slowly and tenderly, celebrating 5 years of marriage and looking forward to all the years to come. More time passed in the way time does, each day blending into the next to form weeks and months and years. The children continued to grow and thrive. Daniel, at 18, was talking about expanding the ranch, about buying adjoining land and increasing the herd. Sarah, at 16, had become the go-to person in the area for horse training and was making a name for herself. Thomas, at 13, was still quiet but had found confidence in his art, selling drawings at the general store. Emma, at 11, was the heart of the family, bringing everyone together with her enthusiasm and joy. Georgia was in her early 30s now, still strong and capable, her dark hair showing just a few strands of silver. Nathan was approaching 40, his face more lined but his gray eyes still clear and sharp. They'd built a good life together, a strong life, full of love and purpose. One evening in late summer, the whole family was sitting on the porch after dinner. Daniel was discussing his plans for the ranch with Nathan, sketching out ideas in the dirt with a stick. Sarah was teaching Emma how to braid her hair. Thomas was drawing in his sketchbook, capturing the scene. Georgia sat in her chair, Nathan's hand in hers, and felt a wave of contentment so profound it took her breath away. This was everything she'd never dared to dream of. This noise and chaos and love. These children who called her Ma and came to her with their problems and their triumphs. This husband who still made her heart race after 7 years of marriage. This home they'd built together from broken pieces and second chances. "What are you thinking about?" Nathan asked, noticing her expression. "Just how lucky I am," Georgia said. "How grateful." "We're the lucky ones," Nathan said, raising her hand to his lips. "Every single one of us." Daniel looked up from his sketches, a rare moment of sentimentality crossing his usually serious face. "Pa's right. We're lucky to have you both. I remember what it was like before, when Ma was sick and we didn't know what would happen to us. You saved us." "You saved us too," Georgia said, her voice thick with emotion. "We needed you just as much as you needed us." Sarah hugged Emma close. "We're a family. That's all that matters." Thomas nodded his agreement, and Emma bounced in Sarah's arms excitedly. The best family in the whole world. They sat together as the sun set, and the stars began to appear. 6 people bound together by love and choice and the determination to take care of each other no matter what. Georgia thought back to the woman she'd been when she first arrived in Trinity, broken and desperate and convinced her life was over. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. She'd been labeled barren and cast out, told she was worthless without the ability to have children. But Nathan had seen her true worth, had looked past the cruel words and circumstances to the woman beneath. He'd offered her love without conditions, partnership without judgment, a family built not on biology but on something far stronger. And together, they'd filled their home with love, just as Nathan had promised that day by the creek. They'd filled it with children's laughter and midnight conversations, with holiday celebrations and quiet moments, with challenges overcome and joys shared. They'd filled it with everything that made a house a home and a collection of individuals into a family. As the last light faded from the sky and Nathan squeezed her hand, Georgia smiled. Her story hadn't ended when that doctor pronounced his verdict or when Marcus threw her into the street. It had just been beginning. And the chapters that followed, the ones she'd written here on this ranch with this man and these children, were more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. The years continued to unfold in their steady rhythm. Daniel married at 20, bringing home a sweet girl named Lucy from a neighboring ranch, and they built a small house on Turner land. Their first child, a boy they named Nathan after his grandfather, arrived the following year, making Georgia and Nathan grandparents for the first time. Georgia held that baby in her arms and cried, overwhelmed by the blessing of it, by the continuation of the family they'd built. Sarah met a horse trader from Dallas, and after a courtship that lasted 2 years because both were too stubborn to admit their feelings, married him in a ceremony on the ranch with the whole community in attendance. They settled nearby and Sarah continued her training work, her reputation growing such that people came from counties away seeking her expertise. Thomas surprised everyone by deciding to attend an art school in Houston. It was the first time any of the children had left home for an extended period, and Georgia worried herself sick until his first letter arrived full of excitement about his studies and his new experiences. He came home for holidays and summers, each time a little more confident, a little more certain of his path. Emma, the baby, grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's blonde hair and a spirit that couldn't be contained. She helped Georgia run the household, learned ranching from Nathan, and talked constantly about seeing the world beyond Trinity. But she also never forgot where she came from or the people who'd saved her when she'd had nothing. One spring day, when Georgia was 38 and Nathan was 45, they took a rare day to themselves and rowed out to the creek where Nathan had proposed all those years ago. The water still ran clear, the fish still darted through the shallows, and the peace of the place was as profound as it had been that first day. They dismounted and sat by the water's edge, Nathan's arm around George's shoulders. "Remember this place?" he asked. "How could I forget? This is where you told me we'd fill our home with love. We did more than that. We overflowed it," Georgia laughed. "We certainly did." Between Daniel and Lucy and little Nathan, and Sarah and her horses and Thomas's constant letters and Emma's schemes, I sometimes don't know if I'm coming or going. But you wouldn't change it. Not for anything in the world. Nathan pulled her closer. "I've been thinking lately about how everything worked out. How you ended up here, how we found each other, how the children came to us. Sometimes it feels like fate, like everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. I used to be angry about what happened in San Antonio," Georgia admitted. "About Marcus and the doctor and being cast out. But now I'm grateful for it. Because if it hadn't happened, I never would have come to Trinity. I never would have found you. We wouldn't have our family. Everything happens for a reason, I suppose. Even the hard things." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek and the birds and the wind in the trees. After all these years, they still didn't need words to communicate, could be together in silence as easily as in conversation. It was one of George's favorite things about their relationship, this easy peace they'd built together. "I love you," Nathan said eventually. "More now than the day we married, if that's possible." "It's possible," Georgia assured him, "because I feel the same way. Every year, I think I can't possibly love you more than I already do, and every year I'm proven wrong." He kissed her, sweet and gentle, and Georgia melted into him the way she always did. Some things never changed, no matter how many years passed. The attraction between them, the love, the partnership, these remained constant even as everything else evolved around them. They made it back to the ranch by dinner time to find the house in chaos. Emma had attempted to make a cake for Thomas's upcoming visit home and had somehow managed to get flour on every surface, including the ceiling. Daniel and Lucy had stopped by with the baby, who was teething and screaming. Sarah had brought by a horse she was working with that had gotten spooked and was now refusing to go back in the barn. Nathan and Georgia looked at each other and started laughing. This was their life, beautiful and messy and full of love and noise and challenges. They divided and conquered, Georgia helping Emma clean up the kitchen disaster while Nathan calmed the horse and Daniel soothed his son. By the time everything was under control, they were all exhausted, but also laughing, telling stories about the afternoon's chaos. That night, after everyone had left and Emma had finally gone to bed, Nathan and Georgia sat on their porch as they'd done countless times over the years. "Another successful day on the Turner Ranch," Nathan said dryly. "Successful might be a strong word," Georgia replied. "Survived might be more accurate. Thrived, then." "We thrived." Georgia looked at him, this man she'd married 14 years ago when she'd been broken and desperate and he'd been lonely and resigned to a life alone. They'd built something remarkable together, something that went beyond what either of them could have achieved separately. They'd created a family, a legacy, a love that would endure long after they were gone. "We did thrive," she agreed. "We're still thriving." and we'll keep thriving as long as we're together. Always together, Georgia promised, no matter what comes. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Summers blazed hot and winters brought ice and cold. Springs arrived with wildflowers and new life, and falls painted the trees in brilliant colors. The ranch prospered under Daniel's management and Nathan's guidance. The grandchildren multiplied as Sarah had twin girls and Thomas came home one Christmas with a wife, a fellow artist he'd met in Houston. Emma eventually fell in love with the new school teacher who'd come to Trinity, a kind young man who appreciated her energy and spirit. Georgia's hair turned silver and Nathan's dark hair showed white at the temples. They moved a bit slower than they used to, took more time to rest, but their love remained as strong as ever. They'd been married over 20 years, had seen their children grow and flourish and start families of their own, had built a legacy that would continue for generations. One evening, surrounded by their extended family at a celebration for Emma's engagement, Georgia looked around at the sea of faces and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. There were children running everywhere, grandchildren and soon great-grandchildren filling the house with noise and laughter. Daniel and his family, Sarah and hers, Thomas and his wife, Emma and her intended, all gathered together in the home Georgia and Nathan had built. Nathan found her standing apart, watching the chaos, and came to slip his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking, love?" "That I wish I could go back and tell that broken woman in San Antonio what her life would become. That I'd tell her to hold on, that everything she thinks she's lost will come back to her in ways she can't imagine. She wouldn't have believed you. No, probably not. I barely believe it myself sometimes, and I'm living it." Nathan kissed her temple. "We were labeled barren and cast out, both of us in different ways, but we found each other, and we filled our home with more love than most people experience in 3 lifetimes." "We did," Georgia agreed, leaning into him. "We really did." As the sun set over the ranch and the family gathered around the table for dinner, Georgia felt a profound sense of peace. Her journey hadn't been easy. She'd faced rejection and shame, had been told she was worthless, had lost everything she thought defined her. But through it all, she discovered her true strength, her real worth, and had found a love deeper and more meaningful than she'd ever imagined possible. She'd been given a second chance by a lonely cowboy who'd seen her value when no one else did. And together, they'd built a life, a family, and a love story that would echo through generations. Their home was indeed filled with love, overflowing with it, a testament to the power of second chances and the beauty of choosing family over biology, love over convention, hope over despair. As Nathan squeezed her hand under the table, and Emma laughed at something Daniel said, and the grandchildren chattered excitedly, Georgia smiled. This was her happy ending, her fairy tale, her dream come true. And it was more wonderful than anything she could have imagined that day. She'd stepped off the stage in Trinity with nothing but a carpet bag and $3 to her name. The years that followed brought more changes, more joys and sorrows, more challenges and triumphs. But through it all, Georgia and Nathan remained steadfast, their love the anchor that held the family together. They grew old together on the ranch they'd built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, all bearing the Turner name, all part of the legacy of love they'd created. And when Georgia looked back on her life from the vantage point of her later years, she never once regretted the path that had brought her to Trinity, to Nathan, to this life. She'd been broken and had been made whole. She'd been cast out and had been welcomed home. She'd been told she was barren and had become a mother to many. Her story had begun in shame and sorrow, but it had transformed into something beautiful, something lasting, something that proved beyond any doubt that family was made of love, not blood, and that second chances were always possible for those brave enough to take them.